After years of apartment living in the Bronx, Daniel and Julia Parnell wanted something more permanent, something with history, character, and land. Daniel was a documentary editor who worked from home. Julia, a pediatric nurse who longed for weekend solitude after endless shifts. They had no children, only a shared desire for peace and roots. In 2022, a listing caught Julia's eye. A sprawling colonial-style estate tucked behind a canopy of old trees in Pound Ridge, New York. The property, nearly 6 acres, boasted a long gravel driveway, original hardwood floors, and a sun-drenched library with floor-to-ceiling shelves. More interestingly, it once belonged to the late Christopher Reeve. Superman's house, Julia whispered the moment she saw the listing. Daniel raised an eyebrow. The price was oddly reasonable for Westchester County, and when they arrived for the viewing, the air smelled like cedar and rain. The real estate agent, a younger woman in navy flats, mentioned Reeve only once. "He lived here until his accident," she said, avoiding eye contact. "After that, he moved closer to the city. But his family held onto the house for a while. The couple moved in by October. By Thanksgiving, they had started calling it home." Daniel was the first to notice it. He'd sit in the library at dusk, his headphones on, trimming interviews for a documentary about small-town jazz musicians. As he worked, the light would fade to blue, and the glass in the windows would darken with reflections of the room. That's when he heard it. Not a voice exactly, more like a murmur. It wasn't music from the street. There was no street nearby. It was coming from the house inside the library. At first, Daniel thought it was a faulty air duct or the creaking of the old walls. But then he started catching fragments of words. "I can still see it. Not the end. Move your legs." He'd remove his headphones and stare into the empty room. Books slept undisturbed on their shelves. No breeze. No television. No Julia. One night, he stayed up late, recording the silence with his phone on the desk. When he played it back the next morning, he nearly dropped the phone. There was breathing, labored, shallow, but steady. Then a voice. "I'm still here." Julia thought Daniel was working too much, losing sleep, drinking too much coffee. She didn't believe in ghosts, not even the kind who once wore a cape. But something in the house was off. She began to feel it in the hallway that led from the kitchen to the downstairs bathroom. The floor, which was level when they moved in, now felt uneven subtly, like walking across a ship's deck. She chalked it up to old construction, maybe a settling foundation. But the carpenter they brought in found nothing. One morning, as she passed that hallway holding a cup of tea, she stopped short. Just past the bathroom door, the air turned cold. Not cool cold. Her breath fogged the air in front of her. And from behind the closed door came a soft, rhythmic thud, like someone tapping their hand against the wall. She opened it. Nothing. No draft. No leak, no pipes, just the faint smell of something sterile, like a hospital room. That night, she confessed everything to Daniel. They sat on the porch until midnight, listening to the frogs and the wind in the trees. "I don't know what it is," Daniel said, his voice tight, "but I think it wants us to notice it." The Parnells learned that Reeve's injury had forced him to move into a custom-designed, accessible home in Bedford. But before that, after the horse accident and before the new house, he had spent several weeks recovering in the very house they now occupied. A friend of his had converted the dining room into a temporary care space. The couple stood in that room now, staring at the corner where a wide table stood. Julia had turned it into her writing nook. She journaled there on weekends. But lately, the drawer would open on its own. Always just an inch. Inside was nothing but air and dust until one day she found a photograph, half faded and curled at the edges. A picture of a young man in a wheelchair, blurry, mid-laugh, taken from a low angle like the photographer was sitting. There was nothing written on the back. But the room changed after that. More frequent cold spots, lights flickering not erratically, but rhythmically, like Morse code. And sometimes, at the edge of sleep, Daniel would hear a voice near the table. "It's not about standing. It's about being still." In January, Daniel set up a small infrared camera in the library, just to humor himself. Every night for 2 weeks, it recorded dust motes and silence. Then came January 23rd. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the footage showed the room shifting in its shadows. No doors opened, no furniture moved, but a figure, a subtle silhouette, not entirely human, passed briefly in front of the camera. The outline was unmistakable. A man sitting upright in a high-backed wheelchair, looking toward the window. Seconds later, the footage cut to black. They moved the camera to the hallway, then the dining room. But it never happened again. Julia told no one except her sister. Daniel burned the footage to a hard drive, labeled it Reeve_confirmation.mp4, and placed it in a locked drawer. They never tried to speak to the presence. But they no longer feared it. Instead, on the anniversary of the night they bought the house, they lit a candle in the library. They left the drawer of the table open. They said nothing. And in the silence, they heard him once more. "You're doing fine. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." The air in Pound Ridge shifted with the seasons, but inside the house, time moved differently. The trees outside grew dense and green by spring, heavy with moisture and life. But inside the Reeve house, the corners of rooms held stillness, like breath being held quiet, suspended. It was the kind of stillness that felt respectful, even reverent, but also alert, a stillness that listened back. Daniel noticed it most in the early hours between 4 and 5 in the morning, when the sky outside was still the color of wet stone and Julia slept upstairs with one arm thrown over her pillow, mouth slightly open, her breathing deep and slow. He had taken to waking early again, not out of restlessness, but something quieter than that, obedience, almost. As if part of the house had reached into his sleep and nudged him up, not rudely, but with insistence. A whisper at the edge of dreams. He would pad barefoot into the library, now his preferred workspace, even though his edit suite was fully set up in the back room. He'd open the windows. The scent of morning soil and pine needles drifted in like memory. And the chair, the wingback armchair next to the bookshelf, the one they hadn't purchased but came with the house, was always slightly turned. Always facing just a few degrees away from how he'd left it. At first, he'd blamed himself. Maybe he'd bumped it. Maybe Julia had sat there. But she swore she never touched it. And once, after aligning it perfectly before bed, he placed a single dime at the base of one of the front legs. The next morning, the chair had moved again. And the dime? Resting dead center in the seat cushion. He never told Julia about that one. Outside, the world continued. Julia worked long shifts, then spent Sunday afternoons pulling weeds from the garden beds. She had built a routine, and routine to her was sacred. But the house was not done with her. It started with the mirror in the hallway. A tall vintage mirror they'd found at a local estate sale and mounted just outside the downstairs guest bathroom. She liked the frame, mahogany, hand-carved with leaf-like detail, to fit the house. But the mirror was wrong. Took her weeks to admit it out loud. There was nothing overt about it, not at first. Her reflection looked back, just as it should. But every so often, usually in the moments before she left for work, when she'd glance at herself to fix a strand of hair or wipe her lipstick, she'd catch it. A delay. Minuscule. A half-second too slow, like a live stream with a weak signal. And sometimes the reflection didn't quite match. The tilt of her head, the way her eyes blinked, the angle of her smile, it was close, but off, as if the mirror held a version of her that had forgotten how to pretend. One morning, she stared into it longer than usual. Her reflection stared back. But behind it, in the narrow depth of hallway that the mirror captured, she saw something move. Not a shadow. Not light, a form, just beyond her shoulder, as if someone had walked quietly past. She spun around. No one. She was alone. The hallway, still and empty, smelled faintly of citrus cleaner. But the air had cooled, just slightly, as if a breeze had passed where none could exist. That was the first morning she called in sick to work in 3 years. By late summer, the house had begun to breathe louder. They both felt it, though they never said so plainly. Not yet. Not in the way that made it real. Instead, they tiptoed around it, mentioning drafts or the house settling or old pipes. All those tired phrases that civilized people use to make sense of things that hum just beyond the range of sense. Daniel started sleeping less. He became convinced that something was unfinished. Something in the house needed completion, acknowledgement, perhaps even forgiveness. But it wasn't malicious. It was more like a presence waiting its turn. He took to researching Christopher Reeve more seriously, not the actor, not the celebrity, but the man. His journals, his interviews, his recovery, the foundation he built. It struck Daniel how much Reeve fought not just for himself, but for those who could no longer speak or walk or move. There was this relentless grace in him, and it made Daniel wonder, if the body goes, where does that grace remain? One night in August, after Julia had gone to sleep, Daniel returned to the library with a stack of old Reeve interviews he'd printed out, pieced together from archived sources. He read aloud to the empty room. I think a hero is an ordinary individual who finds strength to persevere and endure in spite of overwhelming obstacles. The room stayed quiet. Then a floorboard creaked, not under him, not behind him, but just by the bookshelf. The same board that had groaned the night he first heard the voice. He turned toward it slowly, heart thumping hard in his chest. The air thickened again, not cold, not exactly, just dense, like it had meaning. He whispered, "Is this yours?" Silence. He tried again. "Do you want me to keep reading?" A sound, not a voice, but the closest thing to one. A breath, long and drawn. It was not from inside him. It was not his own. He read the next quote. "Some people are walking around with full use of their bodies, and they're more paralyzed than I am." This time, the window trembled softly in its frame. Just once. Just enough. Daniel smiled, heart racing, but not afraid. He felt like a child being allowed to sit in a room meant for grown-ups. Upstairs, Julia woke from a deep dream with the taste of salt in her mouth and the image of a wheelchair in a sunlit room, its seat empty, but turned toward the window as if waiting for someone. She sat up slowly, letting the cool air settle over her arms, and for the first time in her adult life, she whispered into the empty space of her bedroom, "Christopher." And in the stillness of the house, something paused, listened, and moved. Morning came soft and gray. It had rained the night before, just enough to leave the gravel of the driveway damp and the porch steps darkened like old ink. Fog clung to the tops of the oaks and the fieldstone walls that bordered the property like something pressed into place by unseen hands. Julia didn't mention the dream. She dressed in silence, moving slowly, as if the air around her resisted motion. Downstairs, she found Daniel already awake, already dressed. The kettle steamed quietly on the stove. He stood by the window in the dining room, his hand resting lightly on the back of the chair. He never sat in the one near the wall, the one that always stayed pulled out just a little farther than the rest. They didn't speak right away. Words had started to feel fragile, as if any careless remark might crack the stillness that hung in the house like a veil. Finally, Julia said, "Did you hear anything last night?" Daniel turned to her. His face was pale, with the kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying something invisible and heavy. He nodded. "I read out loud in the library," he said. "It felt like someone was there. Not angry, just waiting." Julia moved slowly toward the table and sat down. She looked at the window, where the fog softened the shape of the backyard, the bird feeder, the old apple tree near the fence line. It all felt distant, like a memory that belonged to someone else. "I had a dream," she whispered, not looking at him. There was a wheelchair in a room filled with sunlight. It was facing the window. I couldn't see who had been sitting in it, but I could feel someone was supposed to be there. I felt late, like I had arrived just after they left. Daniel came to sit across from her, their chairs creaking in the morning quiet. "I think he stayed here longer than anyone knew," Daniel said slowly. "After the accident, before the Bedford house was ready. I found an article from a small local paper, hardly anyone read it. They mentioned he recovered here for a while, had a hospital bed brought in, caregivers, a nurse that came every other day." Julia looked up. "In this room?" He nodded. This was the room. They sat with that, let it settle. That evening, long after dusk had fallen and the crickets had begun their steady chorus in the woods beyond the property, Julia returned to the mirror. She had avoided it all day, brushing past it without looking, never pausing to check her reflection. But now she stood before it deliberately, barefoot, wearing only a loose t-shirt and pajama bottoms. The house was quiet behind her. No music, no voices, no television. She stared into the mirror for a full minute before anything changed. At first, it was the corners of the reflection, the subtle bending of edges, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Then a flicker, a shift in the hallway behind her. Her own reflection remained still, obedient. But in the space over her shoulder, the one the mirror revealed, a door slowly creaked open. She turned. Nothing there. All doors in the hallway were shut. The air was still. But in the mirror, the door behind her reflection remained open. Inside, she saw a room bathed in golden light. A large window, an armchair, a shape in the chair. Not fully visible, not clear, but present. Her reflection took one step backward. She did not. Then, without warning, the mirror clouded softly, like breath on glass, and a single word began to form from the condensation. Stay. Julia stumbled backward, heart pounding in her throat, breath caught halfway between scream and silence. The mirror cleared. The hallway was empty again. She did not sleep that night. Daniel began hearing the wheels next. It started subtly, a rolling sound on the hardwood floor, like an office chair being slowly pushed across the room. But they had no office chair on the first floor. And the sound didn't come during the day. Only at night, around the same time, 3:17 a.m. He tried ignoring it. Then he began timing it. For 3 nights in a row, he set his phone to record at 3:15 a.m. and left it on the credenza outside the library. Each morning, the recording was the same. A faint creak, then the low, steady thump-thump of wheels turning one slightly less smooth than the other, like one side needed oil. Then a pause. Then the unmistakable sound of breath. And on the 3rd night, just after the breath, a voice so faint it barely registered. The body may not move, but the soul still learns. Daniel played the clip for Julia. Her eyes welled up before she could speak. They began to treat the house differently after that. There was no discussion, no formal decision. But things changed. Julia stopped closing the mirror hallway door. Daniel began placing a folded note on the desk in the library each evening, like an offering. Quotes from Reeve, encouragements, words of gratitude. They didn't call it a haunting anymore. They called it a presence. But the activity didn't stop. It deepened. Books that had remained undisturbed on the library shelves for decades began falling at odd hours, never violently, never random. Always specific titles. One morning they found a thick biography of Reeve on the rug, splayed open to a chapter titled Endurance. Another day, a volume of poetry by Mary Oliver, a page dog-eared without their doing, revealing the lines. Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Julia cried that day. Then, on the first Sunday of October, Julia discovered the folded paper. It wasn't one of Daniel's. He hadn't written it. She found it under the armchair cushion in the library while vacuuming. A sheet of letterhead, Reeve's old address still embossed in faded blue at the top. The handwriting was messy but unmistakably deliberate, shaped by someone used to speaking through ink rather than voice. It read, "Still here, still learning. Thank you for not fearing me." She stood there for several minutes, the vacuum forgotten, her hand shaking slightly as she held the paper. The house around her was silent, but not empty. And from the corner of the room, the sun dipped through the window at an angle so precise it looked intentional. Winter arrived quietly, covering the fields and treetops of Pound Ridge in a blanket of pale silence. Inside the Reeve house, the cold never fully reached the bones of the place, not anymore. The air felt warmer, fuller, as if the walls themselves had relaxed. By then, Daniel and Julia had accepted the presence as part of their lives. They spoke to him softly, sometimes aloud, sometimes in thought. They played his favorite music in the afternoons. A little Brahms, sometimes Springsteen. Julia placed fresh flowers by the window every week. Daniel lit a candle each night in the library, beside the chair. And slowly, the house quieted. The mirror stopped flickering. The wheels stopped rolling. The breath in the night grew faint, then faded altogether. On a cold morning in January, they found the library still and perfectly undisturbed except for one thing. The armchair had turned fully toward the window, and resting in its center was the final folded note. It read, "Thank you for giving me peace. You may live now. This house is yours." No signature, but it didn't need one. They buried the note beneath the old apple tree in the backyard, just as the snow began to fall again. From that day on, the house never made another sound. But in the mornings, the sunlight always fell directly on the chair. Always warm, always golden, as if someone was still sitting there, watching, smiling, and finally at peace. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.